Before we start talking about some of the attempts at reconciling the distinction between these radically different things, mind and the body, according to Descartes, let's talk about first 4 consequences of his meditations in first philosophy. Right? So there are 4 major consequences which have had massive effects on shaping philosophy as a whole in the following 400 years that life has gone on. 400, nearly 500 years, right? Um, yeah, nearly 500 years. So there's a lot that comes out of these 4 consequences, and they're big ones. The first consequence is a result of the separation between the mind and body, right? Between thinking things and extended things, physical and mental, as completely different. And that is dualism. Right? Dualism is the metaphysical position that the mental and the physical are completely distinct from each other. Right? That, or at the very least, that on some level, the mental cannot be reduced down to the physical, or the physical cannot be, you know, reduced down to the mental or a part of the mental. That in some way these two things are separate, right? And irreconcilably so. Are not irreconcilably, but that in some important way they are different from each other. The second problem is the one that is the focus of this week's lectures, is the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem uh, basically just says that given how completely different these two things are, how do the mind and body interact with each other? Right? What is their relationship? How do we determine their relationship at all? How do they have a relationship, right, between each other? The third one, third consequence, is called solipsism. Right? And solipsism is, even though we're not going to talk about Descartes' other meditations, uh, there are 6 meditations, individual meditations, that make up his meditations in first philosophy. The lecture from last time really only covered meditations 1 and 2. Right? Um, so what happens if we end there, right? Rather than go through the other 4 lectures or other 4 meditations? What happens if we end there is we result in what's called solipsism, the idea that the only thing I can be certain of is that I exist. And there are many people who will argue that that is all Descartes really managed to prove. Right? His arguments for the existence of the body, the relationship between the mind and the body, the existence of a physical world and everything, at different philosophers will argue that his arguments fell off at certain points, but ultimately they all kind of agree that his dissenters, I should say, all sort of agree that the only thing he really proved is that I exist, that I, as an individual mind, exist, and that I can't be certain that any other minds exist based off of his framework. Right? In fact, give you an idea of this view, there's a funny story involving the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who early on was a very, very devout logician as a philosopher, and he concluded that solipsism was the true point of view, right, with regards to the self. That logically the only thing I can conclude is that I myself alone exist, and everything else might as well just be products of my mind, right, fanciful hallucinations. And he wrote an article essentially, that made this claim. An article that a wealthy French lady read, and that she wrote Russell saying, "My dearest Bertrand, dearest Mr. Russell, I read your article on solipsism, and I must say must confess how relieved I am to find another who thinks as I do. Oftentimes, I myself find myself to believe I am the only one in all of the world to truly exist, and it is a great comfort to find a like-minded individual." Um, Signed it, sent it, received a reply that Russell wrote that was, and this is the real poignancy of it. And Russell merely said, "My dear lady, I thank you for enjoying your, thank you for your comments. I'm glad you enjoyed my paper so much. Unfortunately, your own position quite undermines my own. Your position quite undermines my own, right? Your sentiment. Because really, if they were individually the only, or if he really was the only person to exist, having another take comfort from that fact certainly is a disturbing thought. Right? I don't know. I think it's funny, but whatever. All right. Fourth consequence. Now that that whole sideshow, side story is done, is skepticism. Skepticism as a valid philosophical position. You see, prior to Christian dogma, sorry, not Christian dogma, but the influence of Christianity and its centrality in philosophical thinking came along, what we had amongst the ancient schools were a whole bunch of different viewpoints on nature of knowledge, reality, justification, what it means to live the good life. And one of the schools, ancient philosophical schools, was skepticism, right? The idea that we cannot be certain of anything we know as being fact, right? So we have cause to doubt things, right? And for the ancient skeptics, it was the mere acknowledgement that we don't really know, right, the truth of the matter, and to be comfortable in that doubt or uncertainty, right? Once you're comfortable with uncertainty, then you find happiness, right? Because the ancient philosophers from the time of Socrates, really from the time of Plato onward, most of them were honestly concerned with what it means to live a good life in some form or fashion. That was a central question. And for them to live a good life in ancient Greece was, what does it mean to be happy? What's going to make people most happy? So their metaphysics and their epistemology were typically centered around that question. For the skeptics, the conclusion was finding comfort in being uncertain. Right? But then you have Christianity come along, and it takes a huge place with philosophy in particular. And the result is no more uncertainty. You're here because God made the earth, God has a plan, you're involved in that plan. Congratulations, no uncertainty, right? Everything either is true or false, 1 or 0. It's binary. And eventually we can know everything, right? Or we can know at least as far as we can, but everything is in principle knowable, right? The last consequence of the meditations is this skepticism, this ability to say that to reclaim skepticism as a valid philosophical position. That no, we don't know, right? That doubt is a valid philosophical tool, which is something that was done away with. So a consequence is a reemergence of skepticism.